Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. Today, at the end of the show, I will be joined by a co-host, Natalia, who's a science communicator and my former student, to discuss this episode. I'd first like to start with a disclaimer. This entire episode is about sexual assault testing kits, so we will be discussing sexual assault in this episode. This week, we're fortunate to have Dr. Rachel Lovell with us, who's an assistant professor of criminology in the Department of Criminology and Sociology at Cleveland State University. She's also the director of the Criminology Research Center at the same university. So we are pleased to have Dr. Lovell here to talk to us about sexual assault kit testing and the history of its testing in Ohio, how that's changed over time, and how Ohio really became a model for other states to clear their backlogs of sexual assault kits. So such important topics, and we're just so pleased to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So Dr. Lovell played a really important role as part of a team who was responsible for clearing the backlog of sexual assault kits in Ohio. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little about the history of sexual assault kit testing in Ohio and how that changed over time.
Yeah, sure. So the initiative to test rape kits in Ohio began in the Cuyahoga County, just Cleveland area. And sadly, like most things, it started from a very terrible event. And so, maybe something good came out of it at the end, but it was a really terrible event to begin with. So it started as related to Anthony Sowell, who a serial murderer and rapist from the Cleveland area. And he had been in prison for rape for 15 years and got out. And as part of that, several women had reported being sexually assaulted by this man and had reported to police and had actually been able to get away from him. And later, one of them actually got away and had mentioned to police that she had seen several bodies in the house, at which point finally, the police followed up on that report and found what ended up being 11 bodies, decomposing bodies in and around his house. And that terrible event spurred several questions because some of those women did get sexual assault kits collected, and it was part of a larger conversation about, what is Cleveland police doing around reports of sexual assault that led to questions about sexual assault kits. And there was a national conversation going on at the same time around sexual assault kit testing. New York City and LA and a couple other big jurisdictions have started to work on testing some of their sexual assault kits. And that was around 2010-ish. So there was sort of a conversation nationally going on, and then this happened locally. And a lot of the local reporting done by Rachel DeSalle and Layla Atassi started asking a lot of these basic questions like, okay, you're talking about rape kits, like how many does Cleveland have that haven't been tested? And the questions were really shocking, which is like, we have no idea. We have no idea how many kits we have. We have no idea what has been tested. At the time, the policy at the lab was that rape kits weren't to be tested unless there was going to be a prosecution associated with that rape kit. Prior to that, rape kits weren't really tested on a routine basis at all. And so, these kits weren't tested, but they didn't really know how many. And so it started a series of questions around that, around 2010. Anthony Sowell happened at the end of 2009 when they discovered the bodies. And so there was a lot of reporting and a lot of backlash as relates to how are we working with sexual assaults. And a part of that came with what's the deal with the sexual assault kits and how do you not know how many kits you have? And how do you know if they're not tested? And why would the lab not test these kits? Types of things, like why would they be sending them back? And so that spurred a lot of conversation. Then there was a big development happened in the December 2011 when then former AG, Mike DeWine, who's now our governor, but then he was AG. He sent a long memo to all law enforcement agencies in the state saying, hey, if you have untested rape kits, why don't you submit them to BCI, which is the Bureau of Criminal Investigation of the State Crime Lab, and we will test them for free as part of that. So by lifting that cost from them, was hoping to spur some testing. They had prior to that really beefed up their lab to be able to handle what they thought was going to be a couple of thousand rape kits coming in. And so they had worked to develop some of their robots and brought all this technology to be able to process the kits much faster. It ended up being, over time, it ended up being over 14,000 or near 14,000 rape kits across the state that had been submitted as part of that Ohio initiative. We know that that didn't likely get all of the rape kits, but a lot of them were primarily within the statute of limitations, which in Ohio was 20 years at the time. Then the other major development was state law. So in 2015, the state passed, it became effective, that all law enforcement agencies had to submit their rape kits, all rape kits. They didn't have a choice about whether to make the decision to test or not. The legislation said all rape kits have to be tested. And a law enforcement agency has a certain amount of time to submit that to a crime lab. And it also said you have to go back and get all of them, like not just moving forward, but all the ones you have in backlog. If you still have some and you didn't submit it already, you have to submit those as well. So then it became, mandated that they did that. And so that really spurred and created the practice of like all rape kits get tested and, primarily within a short period of time once they're collected.
That's great. And so how did you become involved in this initiative?
I became involved in 2014. Then it was the then Cuyahoga County prosecutor, Tim McGinty, reached out to research center where at Case Western Reserve University, which is where I worked before I came over to Cleveland State, and reached out to our research center and said, I'm looking for a research partner. I started an initiative. He started the task force in 2013. Because Cleveland had started to submit their rape kits and hits were coming back in tons of hits were coming back from that. And Cleveland didn't have any more resources to follow up on those kits.
To get it clear, so that the state had this initiative to clear the backlog, but then there wasn't the staffing or the money for following up on the findings from that.
Yes, correct, right.
Okay.
So like many things in bureaucracies, which is important, you make tiny steps, right? You make a big step, you're like, oh, we'll pay for the testing. You're like, okay, that's just one bit of evidence. Like it still has to be investigated, it's just a lead.
Right.
So you still have to do something with that lead. And in fact, in many cases, it can be much worse in the sense that now you have a lead, you have a name, and if you don't follow up on that, you're creating a great sense of public distrust and creating more unsafe community. So
it must be really hard for the victims too to sort of be in that limbo. Yeah.
Well, most of the victims never knew their rape kits weren't tested. They assumed that they were.
Wow, really?
They assumed that they were, and just nothing came from it. So
there was no communication or anything about it. Wow.
Correct. Right.
Wow.
Back in the day, especially when rape kits were not tested very often, it would take years to get a rape kit tested. And so, by that time, victims were often very disengaged. And, if you waited years to get information about your case, and it was only at the time of going to prosecution or some aspect of that, then, victims just assumed that their kits were tested and that, there wasn't any information that came from the teswhen you really have any idea.
Yeah. When you say back in the day, like what years, how recently was that?
Yeah. When did they start? We started probably routinely testing in around 2012, 2013.
Wow. So just 10 years ago.
Yeah, right. Yes, yeah. Right. Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
So the task force, Tim McGinty formed the task force in 2013 because rape kits had started to be tested, submitted, coming back, or all these hits coming from them. Cleveland PD was like, oh, we don't have any more resources to follow up on this than we did then. Like, who's going to be investigating all of these hits? The AG's office, Mike DeWine, was also like, we're spending all this money testing all of this. We're giving you information. Now we're all like, now we have names of offenders. Somebody needs to, take the next step. And I think one of the big things that's really important to take away from this is that the rape kit testing is just one very small but very important step in this. But it's just the first step. Like, you've got to do all the other steps as well to really get the most probative value from testing those kits.
And can you just, for our listeners, outline what are those other steps that need to happen?
Sure. So when your test kit, it comes back with a lab report. So they tested human, a technician, many of the listeners that you have, or the people, your students or others that hoping to be forensic scientists and other things. They read the results, and then they write a report, right? That report is merely a sheet of paper with information in it that goes into case files, along with the police report and other kinds of information. It gets sent to law enforcement and says, okay, here's the results of the testing. Police are then supposed to take that information and follow up on the information contained in the lab report. Does it confirm who the victim said? Does it confirm the identity? Does it not confirm the identity? Are there multiple individuals in there? Is it also corroborating? So was there, if the victim said that, for example, a certain act happened and they took a swab of that area, and then there was DNA or other sorts of things in that. So for example, he licked my breast and then they took a swab of the breast and his DNA is on her breast. Then, that's a corroboration of some of the information contained in the incident. So take that information, follow up on the leads contained in it, see what information can be gleaned from that. And then, the more traditional practice of like contacting the victim, asking for more information, giving them the information about what the lab report says, interviewing suspects, arresting suspects, charging the cases, prosecuting the cases. This more traditional criminal justice process.
Right, gotcha. And the step where they go from the DNA results to giving a report, they must have to compare their DNA results against some kind of database. Can you tell us a little about that part?
Yes. So the DNA gets compared to, it's actually a fairly complex, I believe, DNA database systems that have different rules and regulations based upon how good the DNA sample is.
Right.
So there's like local databases, statewide databases, and then federal DNA databases. The state and federal ones speak to each other. The federal one is run by the FBI and it's called CODIS, which is the Combined DNA Index System. And it is comprised actually of two indices. That's why it's called an index. There's two different parts of CODIS. There's the part where you take a swab from individuals, someone who's arrested, for example, or convicted of a felony. You swab their cheeks, for example, put that sample in, you say, okay, this DNA belongs to this person, and then we're putting that DNA sample in there. And that's a much larger sample index. Right now it has about 20 million profiles in there federally. But states vary dramatically in the size of their state databases for that. Ohio has a pretty robust statewide database for offenders. Then you have the forensic index, which means you take samples from crime scenes, like collection of evidence from crime scenes. So like a rape kit, or scissors collected at this, something that you thought was connected to that scene of a crime, and you put that information into a side of it. So it's not necessarily connected to an individual's cheek, but to a crime scene. And then so someone can hit to sample from a crime scene, or someone can hit to profile that's already in there because they've already been in that index. All these rape kits have now been tested from the forensic side and are hitting now primarily to the offender side, saying, oh, this person, now we know who this person's name is.
Right.
That doesn't always happen. Sometimes it hits to other just samples of other, right? So it's like
showing repeated crimes.
But there's 3 rapes that this person is connected to.
That's interesting. Yeah. And it's only if people have been arrested for something previously that they would be in there. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. Arrested for a felony in Ohio. And then sometimes there's both, where someone's profile has already been in there, they have a name, and they also have been connected to, for example, a rape kit. So it's like, here's a rape kit. Oh, and by the way, that person is already in the database. So you have both a name and a forensic sample in there as well.
Thank you for that explanation. Now, circling back to your involvement with this.
Okay, so former prosecutor Tim McGinty formed this task force and said, okay, well, I'm a prosecutor. I can do investigative units and I can hire investigators and I can prosecute cases. So he formed the countywide task force, and it's called Cuyahoga County Sexual Assault Kit Task Force, to do just that, follow up on the investigative leads from what is now being done, which is testing the rape kits. And so they reached out to us about a year into it. I think they realized they had no blueprint. Very few cities were doing this. There were only a couple similar cities, Memphis and Detroit primarily. And it was it's a very complicated thing. There were no blueprints. And I think they knew they were doing something different and unique. And in several of the meetings, he was saying, like, please tell us if we're doing the right thing. Please tell us if we're not. We need help keeping and collecting data. Like, we were like research partners. So they funded what we now call the pilot study, although at the time we didn't know it was a pilot because we didn't know there would be more money. But so we started that one that was funded from his office. And then very luckily, the federal initiative came and formed in 2015.
So that was under President Obama?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Under President Obama, they started the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which is part of the DOJ, and provided money to jurisdictions to, test, follow up on the testing, and really it was sort of whole scale provide changing of the guard, new systems. We're not doing backlogs anymore type of thing. Like, what can you do to make sure that there's systemic change? As part of that, though, they also provided opportunities to work with research and research partners to learn from best practices, which is fairly unique at the time, especially for BJA. We were already in partnership with them, and we'd already been working on this. And so since 2015, we've continued to partner with them on a whole series of federal grants funded from the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. And I think there's somewhere around 15 million or more money that has been generated to really do a very big wholesale changing of how the rape kits are tested, but also all the other steps that come after that.
Great. And can you give some specific examples of some of the research initiatives you've been involved with in this area?
Yeah, sure. Some of the very early lessons learned that we were seeing stem from, they allowed me to sit in their task force meetings, and I listened as a researcher, listened to what they were saying. And one of the things that struck me was that here are like very seasoned law enforcement officers, many of them former police, who were now investigators with the task force, who were just shocked at the sheer number of serial sexual offenders that there were being identified. Knowing some about the area, I knew that it was much higher, and what was coming back from how many serial offenders they were identifying was much higher than what the research would have ever suggested. And the reason for that is DNA. So now that it's not relying on the criminal justice system to adjudicate someone before, like you have this this really siloed aspect of the process. Instead, we have it at the time when the victim reported and had DNA collected, and then you're able to to connect them across kind of space and time, these different rapes. The serial offending rates were much higher. So
wait, just pause for a second, because
Yeah.
this is really interesting. So basically, like, previous research had suggested, let me see if I'm getting this right.
Yeah.
Previous research had suggested that like most sexual assaults were one-offs as perpetrators, and what the DNA evidence really showed is that no, there's a huge pattern of serial rape. That's huge. That's a huge advance.
Huge, yeah. So the national rates for sexual recidivism is about 6%, and that's over 5 years.
That term, sexual recidivism.
Yeah. So that means getting caught, basically.
Okay.
And you served time, got caught and somehow went to jail or got convicted, or somehow sometimes you don't go to even jail if it was pled down, but somehow a sexual offense is connected to you. Went to prison, got out, and then within a certain amount of time that we're observing you, did you get caught again?
Okay.
So
gotcha.
Recidivism is really not so much about did you do it again, but did you get caught again?
Okay.
We were having data that was really shocking, which was they were finding a fourth, so 25% of their rape kits were hitting to each other.
Wow.
And if you take into the account that like only about 60% of the rape kits had DNA in them,
right,
and then only a certain percentage of those had enough DNA that they would actually hit to that they could match each other.
right, yeah,
And a fourth of them were the same offender.
That's crazy.
was way higher than that recidivism rate would suggest. Of course, it's not the same measure, right? One is
Right.
saying, did you continue to commit rape? And one saying, did you continue to get caught for
Caught
rape?
for, right. Yeah. Interesting.
But a lot of the people who study sexual recidivism will say like, oh, sexual offenders, they don't continue to reoffend because look at this recidivism rate. And gender scholars have been saying for a while, like, no, like you're using the wrong measure. You can't, recidivism is such a crude measure to understand whether someone's behavior. It's a measure of the criminal justice process as much as it is, or maybe even more so, in someone's behavior.
And
Um,
probably, I'll just put this out there, but is it learning also, like learning not
yeah,
to get
right.
caught? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
there is certainly, at least for the better ones, sort of better in the sense of being a better criminal. There's certainly a better, learning process to that.
Right.
We've done a whole series of papers and publications as data has come in, and we've investigated more and we've gotten larger samples. The latest one we've published, again, this is still a very undercount, and it's measuring, ones that you can connect to through DNA or because they were named suspects, but that rate is 40%. And that's just in our jurisdiction. It's just from victims who reported and had rape kits collected. That was part of this initiative. And still, if you look at those offenders, 40% of them are connected to at least 2 rapes, either through DNA or through their DNA and criminal history.
Disturbing.
Yeah, disturbing, right? But it also really goes to show if you don't adjudicate and get the sexual offenders off the street, this is what happens. They will continue to offend, right?
Yeah.
So, it's really transforming what law enforcement thought about sexual assault. 2 other major things that we're looking at is there's a misconception that sexual offenders primarily only commit sexual offenses. They're a certain type of offender. They're just rapists, but they don't necessarily do the other things.
Otherwise, they're good people.
Yes. Right. And we're finding that's not the case. In fact, there are tied to very serious violent offenses at much higher rates, again, than research would have suggested. And it's because you have DNA now connecting them to rapes that they wouldn't have been connected to. We didn't know that they were we didn't think of them as being so violent because they weren't connected to all these rapes. They were the other offenders, right? Then once you test these rape kits, you're like, oh no, they have all these rapes and also murders and burglaries and and felonious assaults and all these other types of crimes. They're not just specialists, and they don't just, stay kind of in the sexual assault lane. Which also means that if you don't get them, the best way to also get them off the street and to make our community safe is to focus your resources on sexual assault. They often have names attached to them. If you put more resources towards investigating and working sexual assaults, you can also prevent all these other violent crimes because you're preventing them by really focusing on the sexual.
Wow, that's a huge implication.
Yeah. Right. Which tends to be the other way around. They'll focus so much more on the other types of violent crimes and less so on sexual assault. And really, most sexual assault units and police departments are very under-resourced, and it really should be the opposite. The other major thing that we're finding has to do with the just diversity of sexual offending, or basically they have very diverse MOs or modus operandi.
Oh, okay.
They were sort of traditionally thought that like stranger rapists just do stranger rapes, and intimate partner rapists or just intimate partner rapists. Right. But once you connect them through DNA, actually you see a much greater diversity of their sexual offending behavior.
For an individual, like an individual person who's raped has done it in a lot of different contexts.
Right. So we're seeing people, it's called sexual polymorphism or crossover offending is an easier word to say, which is basically like they cross over by age. So they rape children, they rape adults, they rape men, they rape women, they rape intimate partners, they rape strangers, neighbors, and also their patterns are very different. Sometimes they bring a weapon, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they, go to the one neighborhood, sometimes they try another neighborhood. And so even in for example, just stranger rapes, they were really diverse in how they did that. And you would never have been able to know that had it not been for DNA, because there was no other way to
Mm.
connect them because they were so diverse.
Yeah, and I feel like the stories we hear are like, oh, it was realized this was a serial rapist because it had the same MO, but what you're
Mhm.
saying is that's not predictive. Yeah,
No, it's not predictable at all. And the only way,
right.
I mean, when you have no other information,
Yeah,
the MO is the only way to kind of connect them. And it can
right.
be useful if someone does that,
Hmm.
if someone is consistent. But by testing the rape kits and all of them, that's an important component. Before,
Right.
it was only testing certain rape kits, so
Hmm.
we couldn't see the bigger pattern.
Hmm.
Here, you can connect, if you test all the rape kits, now you have connections to intimate partners, to
Right.
acquaintance rapes, to drug and alcohol facilitated rapes, to, stranger, you have to child rapes. Like, you have all of these different ones that are connecting to each other. And for prosecutorial reasons, that is the, difference between one rape and two is exponentially different,
Wow.
because you can prosecute them together and so forth,
Yeah.
potentially. So, really changing how we think about sexual offenders, but also doing a lot of research on improving the system and
Hmm.
how we really failed a generation or multiple generations of survivors
Gosh, that breaks my heart. Yeah.
by not doing this, right? Like, we let them continue to be sexually assaulted. We, as a society, like, researchers
Hmm.
weren't asking these questions, police weren't doing this, prosecutor, like, to me, really, all of us have a role in this, that we fail these survivors. And reading these reports makes it even more poignant that we have failed so many thousands. I mean, like, in Cuyahoga County, they've already finished investigating over 7,000 rapes, and they're working through more. So thousands and thousands of victims, survivors haven't, you basically took off the Band-Aid and saw, we not only did we not test the kids, we didn't believe them. Even if we did believe them, we didn't care enough to follow up. We
Right.
weren't asking the right questions. We weren't doing it in a trauma-informed way. We just continued to victimize them through the systemic victimization. And we didn't provide them support and advocacy like we should have. So a lot of the research I do now is also like, what can we do better, and how do we make the process better for survivors as well?
Can you talk a little about that research? I'm
Mhm.
curious about how the way we listen to and believe survivors has changed or not in conjunction with the change in the sexual assault kit testing and backlog clearing.
Especially because I was in this process. I started very early with the sexual assault kit initiative. I mean, there were, I'm standing certainly on shoulders of amazing gender scholars and others that have been doing this work for quite some time, but to some extent speaking into the void. But with large amounts of federal money coming in that dictated that they have to change, right, as a condition, and sort of, or at least get trainings, and, Obama administration. And it was actually then Vice President Biden was the one leading this up at the time, was really shining a spotlight on sexual assault and on rape and on survivors. So in the time that I've been with this, like, I have seen transformational change in ways that social scientists and criminologists rarely have hope. I think, we're used to working with systems that don't work, and
Right.
we're used to sort of seeing the bad parts of things that don't work. And I have to say, just seeing the change in my own community, seeing even in the language, like, even being like a fly on the wall and hearing how officers talk about survivors, even when they know I'm not, even if they don't know who I am, and how
Right.
that I'm listening, the way that they're processing the cases are different, the way they're thinking about this. There's been transformational change in helping officers, prosecutors, everyone understand about trauma response and brain, how victims respond and why that's not lying,
Right.
helping those basic understanding of what trauma does,
Hmm.
providing better ways to engage with them, providing better supports for them. I'm not saying it's perfect,
Right.
but the language, the way that they're talking about it, the way that they're willing to take those more difficult cases, the way that they're willing to understand that, like, vulnerabilities in the survivors are why they were chosen by the perpetrators. It's not a weakness of the
Right.
case. It's why they were chosen.
Wow.
They were chosen.
Yeah.
Like,
Jeez.
this perpetrator exploited this vulnerability in the victim, not it's a vulnerability of the case. And
Right.
being able to explain that to a jury, for example, and
Yeah.
and hearing prosecutors say, it's my job to explain that to a jury. is amazing, or to say like, what have we done to support the survivor in this, to want to make the survivor want to be engaged in this process? Like, that's a switch that is very different than what
Right.
the criminal justice process traditionally has been, especially
Yeah,
for
change in
survivors.
responsibility, really.
Yeah, but like, no, it's our responsibility
Mm-hmm.
to like support the survivor in this. What have we done
Yeah,
to support them? We're asking them to do something really difficult and painful.
really
What are
hard.
we doing for them to
Yeah,
make that process better? And so the conversations like that, you can really see. I think we still have a long way to go, but now literally, I think last I checked, over 150,000 rape kits have been tested from the federal sexual assault kit initiative.
wow.
And I mean, their statistics are really mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm.
I think we also, benefited from Me Too and from larger national conversations, and actually not just national, worldwide conversations around sexual violence and other things
Mm-hmm.
that helped continue that momentum. Those big high-profile cases like Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and some of those
Right.
others helped also kind of be like, we've got to really change how we respond to this.
Absolutely. Wow. And has the work done in Cleveland become a model for other areas or other states?
Yes, yes. I think Cleveland is held up often as a national model
Wow.
for other jurisdictions.
Mhm.
One is that, they've been doing this for, they were one of the first ones to do this. But two, they really put enormous amount of resources towards doing this. They reopened investigations for every single rape kit.
It's
And
incredible.
it's
Wow.
incredible of like, we can't necessarily assume that the investigation that was done at the time was done in a way that we would do it now, that it was victim trauma informed, victim centered, that they got the information they needed, that these police reports captured the most pertinent details. We will just redo it ourselves with better trained, more resources. And I think that, that's one of the big takeaways from this, is that they were really able to resource their units in really great ways. And I can see it also work with Akron, the sexual assault
Okay.
commission
Uh-huh.
Akron as well. And there's, for example, you can see it in their police reports, how much better their interactions are. I can read it and have to know that their interactions with survivors
Wow.
so much better because of just the way that the writing is different. I can see the difference in the writing of then versus now. I
Mm-hmm.
can see with the referrals for supports, I can see them and helping victims understand like why they can't remember certain things, for
Right.
example, or other
Yeah.
things. So I think Cuyahoga County has been held up, yeah, really as like a national model in this of like, if you, and primarily because they have the most number of prosecutions, both number and proportion, than any other jurisdiction that's been doing this.
That's great.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us and sharing this inspiring story. It's really been incredible to talk with you. So this episode now just made me really disturbed by the backlog, but also really inspired about what you can do if you put your mind to it and you get a good team on it, how you can really completely turn history around like they did with this.
Yeah, I agree. It was all of the emotions. And I really liked how this episode kind of took you through the whole story of how this issue came to light, how certain individuals really took it upon themselves to do something about it, and how that change is already being implemented, and you can see it and you can hear it. And Dr. Lovell was talking about reading, being able to tell just from the documents that she reads that the officers themselves are improving their way of speaking about these things. So that's all very inspiring.
Yeah. The
Well,
other story of this I wanted to tell you, because I just think it's so fascinating, is when I first decided to work on this topic, I wanted to work on it because I thought there was a giant backlog, and that was outdated information. It was from about 10 years ago that I just sort of stored it away in my mind. Oh my gosh, there's a huge backlog of sexual assault testing kits. And I'm a molecular biologist. I could freaking analyze those kits. Like, why are they just sitting there unanalyzed? I know 100 molecular biologists who would go at those kits and test them if they needed to be tested and get trained in whatever methods they need to get trained in. But it turned out it wasn't the biology that was holding it up. It was more like financial and political and just kind of the will of people to submit those kits for analysis. And when I went to think about doing this episode, I looked at a map of where the backlog was, and Ohio said 0. And I was like, that can't be right. But it was right. And that's the amazing thing, is that 10 years ago, there were 14,000 kits, more or less, that were sitting there unanalyzed. And now we're at 0, because in Ohio now, because of these changes, you legally have to submit any sexual assault test kit that's done. It has to go in for analysis, which is incredible. And there is 0 backlog. And that is not true in neighboring states. For example, Indiana still has a big backlog. So it was really, Ohio is just such a great role model in this, which I love, in clearing this backlog and changing the way things work in this area.
Right. And why that's important, right, is because if those sit there too long, then you're at risk of passing that statute of limitations. And so then they have to reopen the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or some of these may not be usable in court after it passes that statute of limitations.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how that works,
Yeah,
but
I don't know either.
I'd assume that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's an update. I went and looked this up for the state of Ohio, and it's actually really interesting. So in most cases of sexual assault and sexual battery, the statute of limitations is 25 years after the offense occurred, except if there is DNA evidence that would determine who the perpetrator is. And then that adds on 5 more years to the 25 if the 25 has already expired. So having that DNA evidence is really important and extends that statute of limitations, at least in the state of Ohio. Yeah, so interesting. Well, thanks so much.
Ohio.
Go Ohio.
Good job.
Right?
Good job, Ohio.
Yes,
Everyone
job,
needs
Ohio.
to
Let's be a role
emulate
model for
Ohio.
other things. Yes. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Nat. I really appreciate
you,
you joining
Laura.
us. Take care.
It was good talking to you. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you all for listening. And thanks so much to our production team, Isabel Espinosa, Sam Carmel, and Baltazar Beretta.